Coming up next, Sitting at 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Harriet Watson, President of the City Club of Portland, and once again, it's my pleasure to welcome you to another outstanding Friday program. Before our featured presentation, a few housekeeping messages, but also some fast-breaking news that many of you might have already heard, that I just heard, that PGE has declared bankruptcy and filed for Chapter 11 about an hour and a half ago. PG&E. Thank you. The importance of connector words. Thank you. Okay. A couple of announcements about upcoming City Club programs. Next week, we'll be bringing the Potomac to the Willamette for a session with Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer, and that will be here at the Multnomah Athletic Club. Please note in your bulletin materials that we are launching a new spring series, which we're calling Uniquely Portland, and it will feature landmark Portland businesses, and this members-only series begins on the 26th. The series will feature visits to and presentations from the owners of Rejuvenation House Parts, Urban Wine Works, Powell's Books, and Clear Creek Distillery. All events begin at 5:30 and will end promptly at about 7. Please call your registration into the City Club office now, as there are only a very few number of slots available. Also, as always, I refer you to our new and ever newly enhanced City Club website, www.pdxcityclub.org. Our board host today is Andy Linehan, member of the Board of Governors and Senior Environmental Planner for CH3M Hill. He will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speaker. Following Andy's question, as always, we will open the floor to questions from City Club members. Please line up behind the microphone in front of the podium even before Andy has finished asking his question, so that we can have as many questions as possible. And as always, the 30 seconds or less rule will be in effect. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Kaiser Permanente Health System, Wells Fargo Bank, and Portland General Electric. As always, we are very grateful for their support. More than 100 years ago, Mark Twain's Pudd'nhead Wilson said, "Habit is habit, and not to be flung out of the window by any man, but coaxed downstairs a step at a time." Well, some could argue that our current habit of wanton energy consumption demands a push down the banister rather than more subtle coaxing tactics. It's difficult, if not impossible, for anyone these days to avoid the issue of energy amidst the barrage of talk and realities of rolling blackouts, botched deregulation in California, record low water supplies in the Pacific Northwest, soaring rates for buying power outside the hydro system, and Oregon's planned deregulation, or, if you prefer, restructuring this coming fall. In an unsettling and sort of eerie 30-year back-to-the-future scenario, the Western states are once again in the forefront of this country's focus on energy. I was living in Colorado back then, and there was a full-scale public information campaign that featured a very adorable mascot, Ready Kilowatt. And Ready Kilowatt encouraged everyone to conserve. It was a very effective campaign for a very short period of time. I don't know what the experience in Oregon was at that same period. This afternoon, we are very fortunate to have Ron Eachus, Chair of Oregon's Public Utility Commission, help us throw some light on the choices and trade-offs involved with this extremely challenging and fast-moving set of issues. It was actually more than a half century ago that a confused and skeptical public was first put on official notice that the nation would soon be gasping for one of its vital life requirements, energy. Ron is an Oregon native and the longest-serving member of the Public Utilities Commission, which includes fellow commissioners Joan Smith and Roger Hamilton. The current commission is hailed as one of the most stable and respected in the country. The commission staff is also held in very high national regard. It's now my privilege to turn the program over to Oregon's top utility regulator to have him share his thoughts on public utilities, deregulation, and the energy crisis.
Thank you, Harriet. I finally made it to the City Club. Before I start, I want to recognize a couple of people. I want to recognize specifically former Commissioner Charlie Davis. He is probably as responsible as anyone for me becoming a commissioner. And for those of us who followed him, he really was a role model for what we felt a commissioner should be like. So, hello, Charlie, and thank you. I'd also like to recognize Mike Katz, who is a former colleague of mine for 4 years, and he is probably as responsible as anyone for establishing least cost planning in Oregon regulation. I'm still quoting his remarks in his first integrated resource planning order, and it truly was a joy to serve with him. Mike, it is... I lost track of where you were, but there you are. It's really good to see you again. And I truly am sorry for your recent loss, but I hope that we continue to see you out and active, as you have always been. Mike, you know, he really spent a lot of time trying to teach me some economics when he was a commissioner. I'm not sure the degree to which he succeeded, and at this point, I really haven't signed up for a letter grade. I'm just kind of seeking a pass-fail. But because you see, I'm not an economist, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an accountant or an engineer. And when you look at it and think about it, I'm not really sure I have the skills to do this job. But I've been doing it for 14 years, and I consider myself pretty familiar with regulatory system. I've worked with all of its complexity and with what Mike and I used to call its art, and I'm pretty familiar with some of its flaws as well as its benefits. And I think the mission of protecting ratepayers against unjust and unreasonable rates is a serious and daunting task. And it's not to be taken lightly. It's not to be trifled with by precipitous actions or by experimentation. And that's why since the late 1980s, the history of regulation in Oregon has been marked by cautious evolution of regulatory policies in which we try and stay ahead and reflect the changes in the industry. Last session, the Oregon legislature passed Senate Bill 1149, which people often call the deregulation bill. I think it's called that more out of a lazy language than it is out of any accurate description. It wasn't traditional regulation, so therefore it had to be deregulation. But that bill was done in the same spirit that we've approached regulation, I think, for the last 14 years. In those 14 years, the industry has changed significantly since 1987 when I became a commissioner. Technology has changed, and we've had a shift from large centralized plants that took a lot of years to build and cost a lot to small decentralized plants that cost less and can be put online in a shorter period of time. And no longer are the utilities the only ones capable of building or operating generating resources. We now have far-reaching wholesale markets that have developed beyond individual state boundaries, and saving energy by being more efficient has become as important and cost-effective as generating energy. Utilities have gone from building resources and putting them in the rate base for a long period of time to buying power on a more open market. And other than the fact that the utilities happen to own the distribution and transmission system, there's no reason why customers do not or cannot have access to electricity supply services different than those provided by the utility. And that's the environment that Oregon began examining the advisability and methodology for restructuring the way electricity was offered to customers. Now, after nearly 5 years of discussion, and some of which was just some dissection of the implications of different approaches and policies, Oregon did develop a plan that enables us to proceed with allowing customers choice, and I believe it enables us to proceed regardless of the status of the current market. So what I want to do today is this. I want to explain why Oregon's approach isn't like California. I want to explain what Senate Bill 1149 really does and clear up some of the myths that opponents have used to argue against it. I want to compare Senate Bill 1149's approach with the existing system, and I hope show you why it is better than what we now do. And I want to explore the consequences of delaying implementation and explain why I think proceeding is worthwhile even in current market conditions. Now, Senate Bill 1149 has been the victim of a lot of emotional rhetoric, and I think a lack of knowledge in some cases of what actually is happening. What you continually hear, and I think what you saw in this morning's Oregonian, is a very simplistic approach that says, we're deregulating, California deregulated, Great Britain deregulated, look what happened there, therefore we shouldn't proceed. And I think we need to go a little deeper than that. You know, we don't do land use planning the way California does. We don't have the flamboyant lifestyle or excessive consumption that California often does. And we aren't deregulating like California did. But unfortunately, there's a lot of politicians out there seeking political attention, or I think using California as political fodder in this time of rising prices to do more political posturing than they are rational arguments. So I guess as the regulator, I'd like to try to return to some sort of rational argument rather than some simplistic labels and to some extent scare tactics. I guess the place to start is really the current market. One of the myths that once we dispose of the myths, then what we're really left with here is a question. Whether somehow going ahead makes the market worse or otherwise harms the customers. So first we have to understand what's going on in the current wholesale markets. Now there's no question in my mind that the markets are troubled, that they're flawed, that they are immature. But it's also true that there is a shortage of supply in the West and that we're facing high natural gas prices, and natural gas being used to generate electricity. That means prices are going up, and future prices of electricity, buying in the future, are going up. We also have reduced hydro flexibility, and we're facing a drought that requires, I think, some emergency actions. So we have high prices regardless of California, driven by a general tight supply in the West, driven by natural gas prices. All of this is exacerbated by California and by some of the general immaturity in the wholesale markets. And some of these factors in the wholesale markets are going to take a long time to address because they involve policies that state and federal government has to develop for regional markets. And it's not clear how long that's going to take. What's clear, though, is regardless of this, we have a supply problem. And I think this is the context in which we have to decide whether or not to proceed. Other thing I want you to consider about the current market is this. The Commission does not have the authority to order a utility to build a plant. We have the ability to determine cost recovery for whether they build or buy, but we cannot order them to build a plant. In fact, building a resource might not be in the best interests of ratepayers, because when a plant gets built and put in rate base, it stays there for 20, 30, 40 years, the life of the plant. And in fact, it encourages the utility, when that plant is tired and old and maybe inefficient, the utility's interest is still in operating that plant until it's fully depreciated. And in this age of new technologies and new types of generation, as well as competitive suppliers, that may not be the best approach. So consequently, utilities have decided, in large part, to buy rather than build. Regardless of that, keep in mind that the price that you pay and what the utility resource portfolio is a combination of what they have now, low-cost assets from PG and PP&L's case, and whatever power purchases they've made. Now, with that in mind, having acknowledged that California is making the situation worse, it's probably worth taking a look at California and why Oregon isn't a lookalike. California divested the resources of the utility. Then California forced the utility to turn around and buy power in a day ahead and a day of market, in a very short-term market, and it prohibited the utilities from buying long-term contracts and hedging that market. You add that with a couple other factors, such as their long siting process and the inability to add new resources, plus a price cap that actually drove out any potential for retail competition, and you end up with the California situation. After California, the admonition was don't do what California did. Don't rush, be thoughtful. But that's exactly what Oregon's done. Because the other difference between California and Oregon is this. California's scheme was created in the last minute of a political legislative session in 1996. It was a result of political deal-making. Oregon's plan is a result, as I said, of over 5 years of discussion in which most of the work was done at the PUC and in which it was developed by the virtue of a consensus-making process that not only involved the Commission, it involved residential, commercial, industrial customers, the utilities, as well as power markets. That is a very significant difference. Oregon was able to build in some caution, some shock absorbers. We were able to ask what-if questions. Those kinds of things were not done in California. In fact, I would say this. Oregon is not really deregulating. We are not deregulating anything that we currently regulate. What we are doing is this. We are giving larger customers the right to purchase power from someone other than the utility. And in order to do that, we have to redesign the rate structure and the prices that are offered. But the utilities are still required to offer regulated rates. What Senate Bill 1149 did is three things. First, it established the right of the non-residential customers to buy from someone other than the utilities. Second, it created a 3% set-aside of utility revenues to fund public purposes, primarily energy efficiency and new renewable energy resources development. Now, this wasn't a 3% rate increase because what this is doing is backing out of rates money that would otherwise be spent by the utility and paid for through rates for these purposes. What it did is it provided a stable, consistent level of funding for these purposes. The third thing it did is it maintained protections. It maintained protections for customers that are embodied in the current regulatory system, and this is something that many of the opponents of 1149 often ignore. Summary. 1149 provided the protections that the customers have always had, but they provided choices and options customers have never had. And furthermore, these options and these benefits and protections were designed to apply regardless of the current status of the market. Let me try and give you an idea of what 1149, what the provisions are. It doesn't require the sale of any assets. Utilities can negotiate long-term contracts. No customer is forced into the market. All customers receive a regulated rate. All customers retain the value of existing assets. And customers who buy power from a non-utility will have the opportunity to return to a utility offer. And residential and small commercial customers will be held harmless if another customer does choose a non-utility provider. Residential and small commercial customers are going to get a portfolio of options. one of which will be a cost of service option just as they have always had it. Now it's true, it's going to cost more because rates are going up, but those rates would go up regardless of whether Senate Bill 1149 was in effect. There is no cause and effect between the rate increases and implementing Senate Bill 1149. In addition to that, the other option they'll get is a time of use option, and this is a market-based option. The price is going to vary by the time of day and the season, and the rates will be fixed, and the customer will know the rates for the year when they sign up. The option includes a time of use meter, which we have never really promoted before, and the costs are going to be minimized, the meter are going to be minimized and spread over time. Key element here is that for the first year we're designing it so the customer will be held harmless. The purpose of the option now is to motivate less on-peak usage without exposing the customer to significant risk or inconvenience. And this is a market-based rate, a greater ability to control their own bills. And reducing peak load will reduce the high wholesale price volatility and benefits the region by increasing reliability of the transmission system and reducing the likelihood of energy shortage. It's also going to offer us the ability to start offering more sophisticated equipment. Utilities are going to submit a plan to the PUC, I believe, by June 1st for small load control pilot to test load equipment on customer premises. We're finally starting to get into more types of energy efficiency that have the customer, have more options for the customer than simply accepting the programs and the rebates that the utility delivers. There will be 3 renewable options. There will be a block, which you can buy in a certain amount of power for renewables in blocks of whatever you want, and the rest comes from cost of service. There will be a renewable resources blended product in which 50% has to be renewable, at least 15% new. And then there's a fish mitigation product modeled on the for the sake of the salmon program. Resources are going to be dedicated for the residential and small commercial customers in order to provide the cost of service rate. Now, large customers are going to get a regulated offer from the utility, which we're going to call a standard offer. Now, usually I have a visual here, which makes this a little bit easier to explain. I'll try and do it. If I don't, please feel free to ask me about what the standard offer is really like. Standard offer is basically comes from the utility. It starts with the reflecting the market costs of what it would take to supply power to these large customers. But you then subtract from that a transition credit which the customer gets for the value of the existing utility portfolio assets. That credit reflects the difference between the market price and the utility value of that portfolio. Now, ordinarily, what you might have heard about this is it's stranded costs in other states. But since our resource portfolio is less than the market price, we have negative stranded costs, which we call a transition credit. The customer gets that credit. When you take the credit, which is the difference between the resource portfolio of the utility and the market price, you're back to the resource portfolio of the utility, and it's pretty comparable to cost of service. Important point here is that the customer has that credit, and the customer can use the credit to apply to an offer made by another a non-utility. That enables 2 things. That enables the customer to have choice, and it also enables the competitor to compete with the utility on an equitable basis, because your starting point is the market price, and a competitor can compete against the utility based upon how well they manage the price. Now, I don't expect a lot of activity on October 1. There's not enough time between when we set the rates and when the legislature ends for anybody to be certain what the rules are, so I don't expect a lot of activity. But what I do expect is that once we set the rules, once people know that a customer has choice, we'll start to see some movement in the market. This legislation has one primary, I think, underlying purpose, past the protection of existing customers. It is to enable the customer to have more direct influence over the product and services that it gets. By having a competitor, you have the opportunity to get a product that is designed differently than what the utility might offer you. Might be a different rate, might be a different length of contract, it might be packaged differently with energy efficiency offerings than what the utility offers you. We will also be providing customers with information not only on price, but information on fuel mix and emissions of any product that's offered to them. For the first time, the customer has some influence over what the fuel mix and emissions and the environmental impact of the resources used to serve them will be. Throughout this, I think the biggest question is, prices are high, the market's volatile, why would you want to do this now? I guess the question is, wouldn't a time when prices are high and the only provider you have of service is the utility, wouldn't that be the best time to start giving customers options that they wouldn't otherwise have? A lot of people have said we should wait until the markets settle down or until the price goes down. I guess I'm asking, is it better to say, here's the rules and let the customer opportunities develop with the market than it is to put the rules and choices on indefinite hold while we argue over what's the appropriate timing? Because in the latter, the customer lags behind the market, and in the former, under Senate Bill 1149, the customer can lead the market. Here I think might be a good time to address a couple of myths and compare it with the existing system. I think I've shown that one of the myths that it's like California isn't true. The other myth that's often used is that somehow letting these large customers go to the market, choose somebody else, is going to shift costs to the residential customers and others who don't. Let me tell you that that cost shift is worse under the existing system than it is under 1149, because in 1149 there is no cost shift. The resources that are freed up from the customer leaving, the utility then has the ability to sell into the market and take the risks and benefit. And when it does, it pays for the transition credit that the customer takes with them when they buy from somebody else. Under the existing system, if I give the industrial customer a discount in order to keep them on the system, that shifts costs to residential customers. The cost shift is worse under the existing system. The same, I think, is true with energy efficiency. We want to encourage energy efficiency. If we keep relying on the utility system, we have fluctuating levels of energy efficiency according to utility-specific costs of cost effectiveness. You have difficulty maintaining a consistent level of staffing and capabilities within the utility, and you're pretty much limited. You've inhibited any kind of competition for energy efficiency offerings, and you're pretty much limited to the offerings that the Commission and the utility work out. Worse under existing system than if we proceed under the 3% public purposes. Same with renewables. Under existing system, where it's all bundled into a cost of service rate, try and convince a utility that it ought to go out and buy significant amounts of higher cost renewable energy. Hard to do, even if you say we'll allow you cost recovery. Renewables, worse under the existing system than the way we've designed this, in which we give customers a lot more influence over the fuel mix. A lot of folks have said that, and many of them are people that are actually exempt from this bill, publicly owned utilities, arguing the bill should be delayed because proceeding will somehow make the markets worse. And I'm having trouble with that logic. Let's assume, as many of these people have, that we are getting a lot of new generation. There's a shortage, new generation's coming online, and uncertainty of the rules isn't very important. Well, in that case, it seemed that to not go ahead, you'd have to assume that that's going to make it worse. And I'm not sure how to I can't fathom that. If the larger customers do buy supply from someone else, It frees supply of the utilities' own portfolio to be released to the market. The retail customer in the market means that more buyers are in the market. The release of the utility resources means there's more sellers. Now, if there's more buyers and there's more sellers, that seems like it should add to the liquidity and not make it more volatile. And it should increase interest in new generation. Let's take the other approach. Let's assume that we'll continue to have shortages, in which case we need to stimulate new investment, particularly including energy efficiency and new renewables. Well, if you proceed with 1149 and give the customers a choice of suppliers, doesn't that actually expand the market? And as I've tried to point out, it sets the rules and it eliminates uncertainty about what the market will look like in Oregon. Both should encourage new generation rather than inhibit it. So what are the consequences then if we don't proceed? Well, I think the consequences are we've stuck customers with higher prices and no choices. We have created a great deal of uncertainty about the rules. If you postpone this until after the next legislature, I think you risk losing it completely. It is simply impossible to pick a date in the future and hope or expect that it's going to coincide with the market being just right, just the way you want it to be. Let alone doing it after the legislature. I mean, you can't guarantee October 1, 2003 it's going to take effect any more than you could guarantee right now it'll take effect October 1. And when you got a whole bunch of new legislators coming in, same problem. And the concern is that uncertainty discourages investment. Uncertainty breeds shortages. So if I could offer you a plan that protects customers, gives them choices, which they can start having those choices when prices are high, and they can have those choices as the market develops rather than waiting for the market develops. If I can tell you that it's going to provide more energy efficiency, it's going to provide new renewables, it's going to reduce cost shifts that we might otherwise have, I have to wonder, why shouldn't we go ahead? And I think it really comes down to a fear factor. It comes down to an association of the implementation of the bill with rate increases going into effect at the same time. But it really has to do, I think, with being in the middle of two visions. And I want to close with this because I've probably taken more time than I should have. You have one vision, and it's a vision I hear most articulated by Congressman DeFazio. And that is going back to prior to the 1992 Energy Policy Act, and you have the utilities do everything. The utilities build the plants. The utilities put them in rate base until they're fully depreciated and operate them no matter how inefficient or how tired or how old they are. Utilities provide the energy efficiency investments, the energy efficiency options. Utilities are the ones who rely on to buy renewable energy. And the utilities are expected to maintain a 20% planning capacity reserve. That, to me, is not a recipe for low costs or for long-run efficiency. It's a constrained, narrow system that I think is always adverse to innovation, new technology, or diversity of products. Compare that with the other vision in which we set the rules, we get started, and over time we start to develop not only new investment, more energy efficiency, more renewables, but more influence the customer has over the types of products. Now, if we were really deregulating, which we're not, if we were doing it like California, which we're not, if we were leaving the customer to the whims of the market, which we're not, if we were divesting resources, which we are not, then I could understand and support delaying Senate Bill 1149. But now we can give customers choices that will enable them to respond to the higher costs of the current markets. And I think we have a unique opportunity here, and we shouldn't let the California debacle scare us from proceeding with what may be the best chance we have to survive in the current energy crisis and create the kind of energy future we need. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. These are really exciting times for the energy markets. Before lunch, I thought of Portland General Electric as one of the healthiest utilities in the West Coast, and here I find that it's gone bankrupt during the lunch hour. Stranger things have happened, though, in this period because the markets are truly crazy. You've made the persuasive case that SB 1149 is not deregulation California style. But I wonder whether Oregon isn't nonetheless captive of Oregon energy decisions in a couple other ways. First, by the sheer size of the California market and demand that's been pent up in California for a number of years. And second, by the restraints on siting new energy facilities in California and what appears to be a stronger NIMBY attitude in California than has been the case in Oregon. So even if we restructure our markets here, offer new choice, will our choices and our decisions, wisely made, be overwhelmed by decisions that are continuing to be made in California?
We can't avoid California whether we proceed or whether we retreat. One of the things that's changed, I think, in the period of regulation is the development of wholesale markets and the issues that have surrounded them. When I first became a commissioner, I didn't have to deal a lot with transmission. I didn't have to know much about the transmission system. I knew what the price was. We put it in, included it in the price. Didn't have to deal with transmission markets or even transmission pricing issues. I didn't have to deal with, and Charlie was telling me in a phone call earlier, we were talking, there was a period of time in which utilities figured they didn't have to plan on anything, predict anything. Then we decided we had to predict things, but we found we really couldn't predict very well. And now we're trying to hedge. And the markets have changed a lot. The institutions to regulate and oversee the market aren't there. California is too big to make a mistake and not affect anybody. But the markets will be affected by California whether we proceed or not. The question is, are we better off with what I think are the benefits of 1149? And I just don't think that we can assume that if we don't go ahead, that we won't be affected by California. We will either way, and that's what I think 1149 was designed to do, is to say it doesn't make any difference what the markets are, because we've got the protections, we've got the options, we've got a lot of flexibility. But if we don't go ahead, we were back in the old system, everything coming out, and we risk less generation, and we risk trying to go from legislature to legislature, deciding is now the right time or is it? And I don't think the legislature is in a position to judge whether the market is right or not, and I don't think we have to decide whether it's right or not. The question is, do we have the structure right? And that's where California went wrong, and that's where I think we've got it right. I'm being asked to read these questions without my glasses. And that's okay, I think I got it if I hold it in the right spot. On several occasions, you have stated that deregulation is necessary to encourage utilities to build additional generation. How then do you explain PGE's recent announcement that it is developing a 750 megawatt project at St. Helens, irrespective of whether deregulation goes forward or not? And why are the utilities seem to be discouraging high-efficient cogeneration development at the industrial sites on the basis that the utility will have ample supply from which to serve the industrial customers? Well, it's not clear yet whether PGE's plant at St. Helens is going to be a rate-based plant or not. I think it's clear that we have new generation coming online. The mistake is assuming that everything in the pipeline is actually going to end up being built. And we don't know that. And if it is going to be built, most of it is still going to be built as a non-utility generation, at least from what I've seen in the siting. PP&L's wind plant is not going into rate base. It's an independent power production, basically. Cogeneration, I think that if the utility was indifferent to whether or not the customer generated its own and left the system, and it freed up power that it could then use to sell in the market, I think you actually encourage cogeneration. But until you get the rules, people are going to play it pretty cautiously. And in fact, it is the some cogeneration alternatives that have led us to give discounts to keep the customer on the system, and those discounts have resulted in cost shifts, and we can avoid that under 1149. Okay. Next question.
I'm Don Frisbee, a member of the club. Come from the old days when utilities, both public and private, felt a very strong overriding obligation to serve, which includes looking ahead and being able to meet anticipated demand. You paint a picture about the old system, negative. You paint a picture about the new system with, I think, very good words and good arguments. I know you've looked at the downside of the new system, and I wonder if you could tell us just what your worst scenario is under the new system.
Thank you, Don. First, I want to make it clear that the utility's obligation to serve has not gone away. They still have the obligation to serve. My worst scenario, I guess, is that in the early stages, the utility buys only a year ahead, and that because the way the markets are, that results in some pretty high prices and they aren't able to hedge. And actually, that's one of the things we've addressed. In the initial standard offer, we expected the utility to have the year planning horizon. In fact, because we don't expect a lot of activity during the first year, and because prices are actually lower the longer the contract you buy, we are allowing the utilities to buy, have a planning horizon that is longer for the standard offer obligations than just 1 year. And we have postponed action on the resource plan and some others. The other thing that I am most fearful of is that this is a big change for the public, and that we will not be able to do enough public education, and the public will not understand that the rate increases that we're doing that are likely to come, I don't want to prejudge the outcome here, are not related to 1149, or that we'll get a reaction because customers all of a sudden have choices they didn't have, that they see it the same way as telecommunications. Because when we were first doing this, I'd ask somebody from the general public, well, what do you think about having choices? And they said, boy, if it's anything like telecom, I don't want to have anything to do with it. My biggest fears are out in the market and things we can't control that won't make any difference between whether we proceed or not. I think we have wholesale market problems, and that's the one thing Congressman DeFazio and I would definitely agree on.
Hi, Chris Smith, club member. I have a teenager and a preteen in my household, so I'm a big consumer of electricity. And I've recently invested in several $100s of compact fluorescent bulbs as an act of self-defense. I'm interested in other things that might help me reduce both my consumption and my costs for electricity. You mentioned very briefly some form of peak period pricing. Could you explain a little more deeply how that would work and how it might affect consumers like me?
I will try. Let me give you an idea of the basic design. While I don't have the rates, we do have what it might be designed like. You would have an on-peak period, which is pretty much weekdays 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., and it would be seasonal. You would have an off-peak period, which might be weekdays 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. You would have a mid-peak, and you might have a pricing schedule in which the on-peak is maybe a little less than half of the mid-peak, and the off-peak is maybe about 2/3 of the mid-peak and 1/3 of the on-peak. So you've got, what you are doing is sending pricing signals to encourage people to change their usage patterns. And the other part of this is the 3%. I would expect, we have set up a nonprofit board to run the 3%. The chair of the board, Steve Schell, is here today, as well as our consultant, Mike Smiley. And I would expect that as the money comes in for that after the first year, that 3%, that would begin to be used, and the board would begin to develop programs that would also help the customers. It might, for example, focus on some of the technology that's needed and that helps the customer respond to prices. We might even put that out for bid. Want me to take another one? Okay.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. I don't know how many have seen the Oregonian today. There is an article by Howard Morgan, former utility commissioner, vice chairman of the Federal Power Communications, so on, somebody that probably should know something about it. And the headline is, "Slow down or be prepared for gouged." I suggest everybody read it. What he's saying at some point is that we should look perhaps to public ownership of utilities. And he says we should not do it now, however. It should be studied. And in this context, I wonder, have you, in the 5 years that you mentioned, looked at the issue of public ownership? Have you looked at the cost of acquiring the utilities? And have you run a cost-benefit analysis on that? What brings to mind to me, he's talking about Britain, he's talking about California. I don't know what's happened in Britain except that utility cost is very high, but I do know what's happened to British Rail, which used to be a very good rail system, and it's miserable. In some instances, it may even be worse than Amtrak. And the reason is that it's been split. There are companies that own the track, there are companies that own the signal, and there are quite a number of companies that own the rolling stock. They've had accidents, they've had people killed, they've had all kinds of things. So,
Well,
back to the question, have you run a cost-benefit analysis of acquisition, and what is it?
No, I haven't. It's not my job. And
you don't know.
I don't. It's not my job. I can tell you this, though, that I think one of the things that you seriously need to look at if you're looking at public ownership is the fact that you are could be adding significant new, if you're expecting BPA to provide you with power as a public owner, because my understanding is as a public owner, you're taking over the distribution system. You're not taking over the entire system, and you may end up, relying on BPA or having to buy power out in the market yourself. And with BPA rates going up, you might find that that's not as attractive as you think it is as far as price goes. Now, there are other advantages, I admit, to public power, but I guess I would say this. I've seen a lot of private power, I've seen a lot of public power, and I don't think either one can lay claim to necessarily being an efficiently operating utility by virtue of its ownership.
Brad Avakian, City Club member. I believe some have voiced concerns that there could be a potential negative environmental impact by a more competitive industry. And I wonder if you could make a few comments on the potential risks or benefits to the environment of a less regulated industry.
I think you balance a couple of things. The environmental regulations are in somebody else's bailiwick. So I don't think by virtue of being competitive or non-competitive, you necessarily are worse or less environmental. I guess I look at it and I think, I'll give you an example of CO2. Regardless of what you think, the one thing we know is that nobody can seem to figure out a policy to address CO2. So here's my solution. Give the customers the information so they can decide whether or not a product that has less CO2 is more important to them than another product. We can do that under this. We can't under the other. I think we can encourage more new renewable resources. That's of environmental benefit than otherwise. Of the things that are within my control, I feel like I can do more environmental benefit by proceeding than by retreating. And even if you look at new generation, I would rather have knowing what the rules are and encouraging more generation than less, and trying to avoid a shortage situation where our solution is a bunch of diesel generators. So, you need an environmental regulator up here to really give you an answer to the question. I feel like proceeding puts us in a better, in the realm over which I have some control and influence, puts us in a better environmental position than we would be otherwise. Congressman.
David Wu, and frequently a City Club member. There's something I'm trying to understand about how you've laid out the future under a restructured or deregulated scenario. There are currently cross subsidies, you say, for the large customers, and they have lower costs. But if we break up that cross subsidy, these large customers will get even lower costs out in the open market because of some of the benefits that they can take with them. And if we permit the utilities to, in essence, monetize the stranded assets, then that permits them to give small customers, residential customers, lower costs also. And it just seems to me that, in the new world that you paint, everybody's going to get lower costs. That's the discussion. I'm a little concerned. I'm not sure how the numbers hang together here, especially in light of my general impression that what people really care about is that when they flip the switch, the lights go on, and it's that dependability factor that folks really, really care about.
Thank you, Congressman. I think this might give me a chance to clear up any misconceptions that may have been resulting from a too confusing explanation. There are not cross subsidies existing now, except to the extent the residential customers may actually be, or to the extent that industrial customers may to some extent be paying more than their share. We would, on a normal course of events, be trying to eliminate that and get everybody to the same level in which customer classes are paying 100% of their share of the cost they impose on the system. What happens in this 1149 is we take the residential and small commercial customers, and they get a cost of service rate based upon dedicated resources, and it's basically setting rates the same way we would now. Under the old system, if an industrial customer wants to leave, and they say, unless I get a discount, I'm going to leave, we try and keep them on the system, because if they leave, it's a lot less revenues to the utility, and it shifts costs to other customers. If I give them a discount, I've reduced the amount of cost shift, but I still have cost shift. Under 1149, since we've now walled off these residential and small commercial customers, if a large customer leaves the system and buys from someone else, what it does is it leaves a chunk of power available that the utility has now, and it has no revenues for it. But it enables the utility then can go out into the market and sell those. Now when it sells those, it has those revenues. If the market price is higher than the costs, the difference gets used to pay for the transition credit that the customer gets to apply and take with it. The credit, remember, represents the value of the utility's assets and the difference between that value and the market. So other customers aren't affected, and the utility pays for the transition credit. See, if the large customer buys from the standard offer, it's paying for it. It's covering the utility's costs, and the transition credit is really just numbers. I mean, there's nothing that that the utility has to pay or use to pay. But if the customer buys from someone else, they're not buying from the utility. The customer gets the credit, so the utility's got to find some revenue to pay for that credit, and they get it from selling into the market. The other customers, they're left alone. It doesn't shift any costs to them because we've walled them off. We've given them dedicated resources. It's a lot easier when I have a visual, but it's a radio audience, and Ann.
Thank you, Ron. You and I disagree on many things in respect to SB 1149, but I wanted to ask you a fairly narrow question regarding the standard offer. You've said several times that there would be a regulated rate available to every rate class, including non-residentials. And I'm assuming that by that you mean the standard offer, which will be based on market, and the application of the transition benefit will bring it down to approximate what rate they might otherwise get. What do we have in terms of regulation that will assure that that rate remains fair and reasonable, both now and in the future when the transition benefits are depleted?
Well, you have that the rate has to be approved by the Commission.
And on what basis will the Commission approve it or disapprove it?
Well, on the basis of the various components. You have the market price, and you will have to establish an index or some determination of what that market price is. That market price, if we continue with an ongoing valuation, then you will always have the transition credit will always float up and down with the market price compared to the value of the existing resource. The Commission will determine the value of the existing resources on the same cost basis that we would now. What's the cost of the generating resources you own plus the power that you buy? It's pretty much the same as we do now.
So
I think the problem is trying to determine what's the planning horizon that you want the utility to use in order to buy power ahead. Now, if we end up with as long as you've got an ongoing valuation, that's pretty simple. If you end up trying to say at some point in time we're going to fix that valuation, then we're in a lot more complicated process. But this is one of those things that I don't think change. We still have the responsibility to make sure rates are just and reasonable, and we still regulate it, and it still has to be approved. And we're doing it pretty much on the same basis as we have, and the same principles as we have before. The formula, the algorithm's a little different, but it's the same responsibility.
Excuse me. We
Let
have
me
time
ask for
one
clarification.
more. You'll have to follow up after the formal program. We have time for one more question.
Apparently from your remarks today, I'm Anne Marie Claire, City Club member, also research board member, but I'm speaking out of my own individual interest. Since the Commission seems to be working on a sort of pro-competition model based on not price caps, but building more supply to drive the costs down for the consumer, that would sort of indicate fast-track siting of generation and transmission. And yet we have a strong environmental focus, and those are going to be dueling things, as you mentioned in another question before. Do you ever see a different scenario that came out of the model of the United Kingdom, which was initially they disintegrated the utilities and broke them into generation companies, distribution companies, and the transmission grid. The generation companies made all the money originally, and then the regulators came in and forced a price cap, which was tracked to the fuel costs, tracked to economic indicators, and still allowed a profit margin. Do you ever see a possibility for that model, or do you just see that building more generation is the answer?
Well, I think there is a supply shortage. There's no question we need new additional generation as well as new energy efficiency and conservation programs. We are only unbundling the rates for transmission, distribution, and generation, and only separating the functions. We are not separating the utility. We're not dividing the utility into a generating utility, a distribution utility, and a transmission utility. In order for utilities to do that, they would have to seek approval from the Commission just as any other asset sale. We don't do siting. There is legislation to speed up and change the siting process. My point on generation is that I think if you want new generation, You need to set the rules and go from there rather than continually having uncertainty about the rules. And if you want new renewables, we're in a lot better position the way we've designed it than keep trying to convince the utilities that they ought to invest in new renewables and put it in rate base.
On behalf of the City Club of Portland, I'd like to thank you, Ron, for sharing your afternoon with us and for your ongoing work on behalf of all of us. And my one takeaway is, will the last person out of the room please turn off the lights? Thank you.